this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. David Stirling is synonymous with the wartime SAS, but the real brains behind the operation was, in fact, Bill Stirling, David's eldest brother. Having originally joined the SOE in March 1940, Bill Stirling sailed for Cairo in 1941 and there had the idea for a small special forces unit to be led by his mercurial brother. But despite some success, David allowed the legendary SAS to drift under his leadership. Following his capture, Bill redirected two SAS under his personal command to the strategy he had originally envisaged, parachuting behind enemy lines to gather intelligence. Joining me today is Gavin Mortimer. Gavin is the author of a number of books focusing on the SAS, including a biography of David Stirling. His latest book is 2 SAS, Bill Stirling and the Forgotten Special Forces Unit of World War II. Thanks for joining me, Gavin. So we know David Stirling as the founder of the SAS, but he had an older brother, Bill, who would eventually command 2 SAS. How involved was Bill, if at all, with the creation of the SAS?
The joke in 1941-42 was that SAS stood for Stirling and Stirling. And Roy Farron, who was one of the great figures of the SAS, DSO, MC and Bar, when he wrote Winged Dagger in 47, he described David and Bill as the pioneers of the SAS concept. And others alluded to their partnership too. And indeed, the SAS War Diary that was assembled immediately after the war by senior SAS officers said that Bill was in Cairo at the time that the SAS was formed and played a large helping hand with David in forming the SAS. Crucially, however, and very significantly, the War Diary described Bill as the man from the shadows. And that's the key, that Bill was very different in personality from David. So it was a joint effort, but Bill was really the intellect. He was a much more stable character than David. David was, if you like, the front man. And I'm sure a lot of people saw the Rogue Heroes, the BBC drama, which I thought captured David's character very well, this rather overconfident young man. Like a lot of brash, overconfident young man, it hid deep-seated insecurities. Bill didn't have any of those. So in a way, they complemented each other very well. And as I said, it was a joint effort. And Bill, of course, was very well placed. He was working as the assistant to the Deputy Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Arthur Smith, who was second. So he was the deputy to Wavell. So he had access to the high command. And of course, also he knew where there was a possibility for a new special force. Because don't forget, who were the real pioneers of special forces in the desert, the Long Range Desert Group, who were raised by Ralph Bagnold in June 1940. So what Bill and David did was this idea of a parachute unit, which was an idea formed in July 1941. And
I'm slightly intrigued by it as well, though, because you have two brothers and they both sort of end up in what we'd now call special forces. But Bill was already working with SOE, wasn't he? Special Operations Executive. Am I right in saying he's singled out to be asked by Colin Gubbins, who's running SOE, to command an amphibious unit? Where's that fit in with what's happening with the SAS, the original SAS?
Again, that's very important. But really, I describe Bill Stirling as the father of British Special Forces. And because, as you said, he was in the forerunner of SOE was military intelligence research. Very short-lived outfit at the beginning of a war. And it recruited people really often on the background of what university they went to, what public school they went to, what bank they worked for in the city. So you had some very unsuitable characters in terms of temperaments and experience. But you also did select really by chance. And Bill Stirling was one of those. He had been commissioned into the Scots Guards in 1932. on the same day as his cousin, Lord Lovett, who obviously of great commando fame in the war. He resigned his commission after 4 years, really because he had so many business interests. And also he was the laird of Cairo, the family estate. So the Stirlings were very, very wealthy. When the father, Brigadier General Archibald, died in 1931, he left 9 million in his will. Bill, being the eldest of 6, he was groomed to command from a very early age, being the firstborn. David was the 4th of the 6, and like many siblings in a large family, really struggled to make his mark, if you like. In fact, a lot of parents at the time of the upper class, they were loving parents, but, Nanny did everything. They had the household staff. So, David was really wanting to grab his mother's attention, whereas Bill had it, being the firstborn, and went into business with his mum. So, outbreak of war, he rejoins the Scots Guards, but he's quickly headhunted into military intelligence research, forerunner of SOE. And in April 1940, he, along with 5 others, are selected for a guerrilla mission to Norway a couple of weeks after the Germans have invaded. And the task is there to land in southern Norway, link with the Norwegian partisans, and carry out sabotage on German lines of communications. They leave from Rosyth. Unfortunately, en route to Norway, the submarine hits a surface mine and is seriously enough damaged to force the submarine to return to base. The mission is then aborted because of what's happening in Norway, and the realization that it's too late really to force such a sabotage mission. So Bill invites the 5 others back to the country pad at Cairo, which is near Dunblane in central Scotland. And they're over a weekend and a lot of whiskey and a lot of grouse. There's a realization that this was, in that endearingly British way, a bit of a farce. No one actually really knew what they were doing. It was very much go to Norway and, best of British. And he said, look, no, we need to be more serious because Germany are sweeping through Europe. We're on our own. How can we hit back through guerrilla warfare? So Bill comes up with this idea of a special training centre, a guerrilla warfare school. He goes down to the War Office, pitches the idea to the War Office. Timing is impeccable, just as Churchill replaces Chamberlain. Churchill, big fan of special forces, of commandos, something that he'd first seen in the South African War 40 years earlier as a correspondent. So he gets the go-ahead, and the Special Training Centre opens at Loch Islet in the northwest of Scotland, June the 3rd, 1940, and Bill is the chief instructor. He gathers round him experts in demolitions, in unarmed combat, navigation, mountaineering, sailing, and through the gates of Loch Islet, throughout the rest of 1940, come hundreds and hundreds of commando volunteers. So really, Loch Islet, a lot of people have heard of Achnacarry, which is the commando school, famous, opened in 41 and 42, and Loch Islet was the forerunner, and that was Bill. So he very early on identified that this was going to be a war with the interwar developments in small arms, in communications, in transport. It wasn't going to be like the First World War. And also the British mentality. He was in charge of a large staff at Cairo of hundreds of domestic staff, ground staff. So he knew the British character very well. The Loch Islet the special training centre was a great success. David Niven went there. David Stirling, contrary to popular belief, wasn't an instructor. He was a pupil. And then in early 1941, Bill was returned to SOE and was sent to Cairo on a mission. The mission didn't really work out. SOE was a bit shambolically organised in Cairo. Bill wasn't happy. And that's when he was then, again, headhunted, a sign of esteem in which he was held, by GHQ. And then there we have, at the same time, David has gone out to Cairo with number 8 Commando, Lay Force, commanded by Robert Laycock. That's a bit of a disaster too. The Germans have joined Rommel's there, and what the commandos had expected to do, raids against various Italian targets. At the beginning of 1941, the Allies had been very much in control of North Africa. By the summer of 41, Germans have pushed them back. So David Stirling's at a loose end. and he has this idea for a small parachute unit, and that's with Bill. He takes it on. Very important, the last point to make, Angus, is that out there, Michael Crichton Stewart, who is an officer in the Long Range Desert Group, who is a family friend of the Stirlings, Bill knows him very well, and so they they pick each other's brains, if you like, and they see what the Long Range Desert Group's doing. They do raid, but their forte really is reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. And so they see, now there is an opening then for a special forces unit to parachute behind enemy lines deep into the desert. They can be picked up by the Long Range Desert Group. And that's really how the SAS came into being. So it was a joint effort with Bill and David, with input from others too.
I was getting the feeling that Bill seems the man that understands the sort of wheels of bureaucracy, which makes him probably quite a good CO of any unit to bump along well with other people. But how do we get from him being in charge of the small scale raiding force to being to the creation of 2 SAS? Am I right in thinking there's somehow a connection via Captain Lord George Jellicoe? Is that the connection that smooths the creation? No,
not really. Jellicoe is again a family friend, same social class, obviously. What happened is Bill was, as I said, was a man born to command. He was an aristocrat, so he rather did what he pleased, which is a Stirling family trait. They did or tend to do as they pleased. And when he went to work for GHQ in the summer of 41, he didn't tell the War Office. The War Office thought he was still with SOE. So when the War Office found out that he was with GHQ, they were furious. And they ordered him back to the UK. So he was forced to leave Cairo November the 3rd, 1941, 2 weeks before the inaugural SAS mission. Fascinatingly, David Stirling writes to their mother a week or so later, just before the eve of the first mission, and says he's very sad that Bill's no longer with him. He also feels homesick. He says he hasn't felt this homesick since he was at boarding school, which in a way is an astonishing admission for a man to make. Bill was his intellectual and his emotional crutch, and suddenly Bill, the big brother, is no longer there. So then he's back in the UK. Again, this is so British in a way, that you got one of these great military minds, and what happens to him? He's more or less sent on to the naughty step. And there he remains for 9 months. He goes back to Scotland and he more or less leaves the military and he goes back to his business interests. Then in September 1942, as you said, the small-scale raiding force, which was led by Gus March Phillips, who incidentally went to Ampleforth, was a contemporary of Bill Stirling. And of course, David Stirling went to Ampleforth. And Lord Lovett went to Ampleforth. So Ampleforth had produced these great guerrilla fighters. And that was a good school for them. You really learn self-sufficiency. Interestingly, David, as I said earlier, he was homesick. He didn't enjoy it. He wasn't a sportsman and he wasn't as outgoing as Bill and Lord Lovett. So, but anyway, Gus Marsh Phillips is killed in an operation in France, and they need someone to lead it. And suddenly, some bright spark remembers Bill Stirling. And so Bill Stirling is appointed CO. You mentioned him earlier, actually, Angus, Gubbins. Gubbins gives a glowing character reference, saying that he's just he got great power of command, natural authority, disciplined, innovative. So all the qualities you want. So he takes over as CO of small-scale raiding force, which then becomes number 62 commando in October 42. Now, there's a bit of a territorial dispute going on between SOE, who are increasingly annoyed at these commando raids on their territory, stirring up the Germans, and also with the weather closing in. Bill decides, and this is where George Jellicoe comes in. This is we're in December, January 1942, 1943, that George Jellicoe comes back from the Middle East. He joined SAS in early 42. It's really to discuss the future of special forces. The war in North Africa is clearly going the way of the Allies. So next it's going to be the Mediterranean. What role will the SAS, which by now has expanded into a regiment. So from initial intake of 6 officers and 60 men, it's now a regiment about recruiting up to a strength of about nearly 500 officers and men. Eisenhower, who's seen what the British Special Forces, the effectiveness, wants a unit in the Western Mediterranean to operate alongside him. And that unit, it's decided, will be number 62 Command. Now, while this is going on, David Stirling very irresponsibly gets himself captured. January the 24th, 1943, an ego trip really, driving up through Tunisia, wanting to be the first representatives from the British 8th Army to link up to the First Army, British First Army coming east through Algeria and then down into Tunisia, has a kip in Wadi, doesn't post any sentries, and is captured. Huge blow, because David's unique way of administration was to he had a filing cabinet in his head. So chaos ensued at the SAS base in Kabrit, which is about 80 miles east of Cairo. Bill Stirling is sent to sort out the chaos, and he does so. It is proposed that he takes over one SAS, but he comes up with a suggestion that, in fact, all these what's known as private armies are gathered together under an umbrella title, which is Special Raiding Forces. Appointed to command that is a First World War veteran, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Cater, who's very much a chairman of the board and very good administrator, very good diplomat at smoothing. You know, a lot of the regular infantry units don't like private armies because they tend to skim off their best soldiers. As part of that reshuffle, George Jellicoe takes command of the Special Boat Squadron, so the SBS, and we're now in end of March 1943, and Bill raises 2 SAS out of number 62 Commando. So it expands, and he becomes the CO of 2 SAS, officially raised, or the official birth date is May the 13th, 1943. And in the meantime, Paddy Mayne, very well-known name, not the wild Irishman often depicted in books and TV, but a very intelligent and a brilliant guerrilla fighter, takes command of 1 SAS.
Am I right in saying the first 3 operations, the seaborne raids on some of the on Lampedusa, Pantelleria and Sardinia? Now, reading about them, they're all frightfully exciting. I was sitting there, I don't know which film it is in my head when I was reading about them quietly coming ashore. Could be Guns of Navarone or something. But then the raids are a failure. Now, I wondered how much of a problem is that for a unit that's trying to prove its worth, that's been sort of newly formed? You know, what are the points of failure for them?
Yeah, no, the first raids were a failure. They were very much learning on the job, if you like. And of course, these were amphibious raids. So, and they'd recruited from the infantry and from the guard. So they trained. Their base was at Philippeville in Algeria, and they were reconnaissance raids. Very poor intelligence. So really, they didn't know what they were getting into. So they arrived on these on the islands to be faced with sheer cliffs and not the beaches that they'd been told they would, a relatively easy scramble. No, it wasn't, and heavy anti-aircraft defences. But to Bill Stirling, this wasn't really a problem. I think they lost 1 man on one of the raids, but luckily they didn't suffer heavy casualties. And the same happened in the first raid, or the first major raid by parachute on Sicily. Operation Chestnut in July the 12th, 13th, 1943, when 2 parties were dropped into northeastern Sicily to really gather intelligence and, if possible, to ambush German convoys. But again, the intelligence was poor. But at the same time, Angus, what Bill was agitating for was, I'll just read you, if I may, a memo that he sent to 15 Army Group in Italy. On July the 1st, 2 SAS Regiment is prepared to accept rough, unreconnoitred landings which can easily be undertaken with imperceptible increases in dropping casualties and advantages too obvious to mention. After a few months, should requirements appear for the disruption of Italian communications via Albania to Greece, a force of 300 men could work over hundreds of miles in up to 140 parties with shattering effects. In Italy, jeep patrols brought in by gliders could fight their way to vital objectives with explosives by the ton. This is very innovative. And a point I make in my previous book, a biography of David Stirling, is that it's very interesting. If you look at the SAS, really for the first year of its existence, certainly the first 8 months, it didn't fulfill its potential. The first raid, which I alluded to earlier, was a disaster when they dropped by parachutes to attack 5 Libyan airfields, and of the 55 men who dropped, 34 were killed or captured. And thereafter, very interestingly, there was not another parachute operation in the desert. Now, the desert in that part of the world wasn't really done for parachuting, but also I think the LRDG were there to transport them. And I think one has to say that Stirling had badly injured his back from parachuting, and the heavy casualties probably, he just said, I don't want to risk it again. But Bill Stirling, he really went, as soon as he raised 2 SAS, he reverted to the original raison d'etre, which is dropping, saturating an area deep behind enemy lines with small parties. So we're only talking 2 or 3 men to cut railway lines, to mine roads, to bring down telegraph poles. For the first 3 or 4 months of 2 SAS's existence, he was continually fighting a battle to make the top brass understand this. And they couldn't. Their minds just weren't attuned to the way Bill was thinking, which again goes back to my point that Bill was the real innovator and the visionary in this area. So the first successful 2 SAS operation was Operation Speedwell. Bill didn't get his 140 parties. What he got was half a dozen parties of 2 and 3 men dropping around La Spezia in northern Italy. Between them, they blew 5 trains off the line, brought down several telephone wires, and had a company of elite mountain troops hunting them. So for such a small number of men, they caused an inordinate amount of damage. Bill's point was, and this was, he kept hammering this, making himself unpopular, which we'll see had ramifications in 1944 with the top brass, by saying, look what I did with 13 men, 130 men. Look, imagine what I could do. We could completely disrupt the Germans, hundreds of miles north from the main Allied invasion force in southern Italy. It
almost strikes me that they're almost controlled failures that he's organising, he's overseeing, which actually works in his favour. Because, those raids, when they start to go wrong, they don't reinforce failure, they withdraw. You're using small parties means that you don't have a massive failure. If one party fails, it's one part, but there's seeds of them.
You're right, Angus. In Operation Speedwell, only 5 of the 13 men returned. 5 were captured and executed. But that would have been worth it for what they achieved. Bill was not ruthless, but he was honest enough to know that, in this, and that, of course, is what the volunteering is. You're volunteering, and they knew the risks. They underwent the training. And before Speedwell, I interviewed a couple of men who were on that, and they said, how do we get back? And Bill sort of laughed and said, well, Shank's pony, your legs. They accepted that challenge. Now, I've searched high and low, and other military historians have too, for operational reports. David didn't learn from his mistakes. Bill did. As you said, Angus, there were mistakes early on. But the reports that Bill wrote were lengthy. It was learning lessons and then putting them into practice later on. Yeah, but Bill was a military intellectual, and he was I've said in the past that really the 3 men most responsible for raising and then evolving and developing the SAS were Bill Stirling, who was the intellectual force, Paddy Mayne, who was the physical force, and David Stirling, who was the salesman. But David was very good at he was just brash. David was physically very brave, and he was also very stubborn and determined. He wouldn't take no for an answer. So that was good in the early days when you did have these, that first raid, which is disaster. Lesser men may have just said, "Oh well, we gave it our best shot, boys. Back to our parent regiments." But David was determined it would succeed, and he deserves great credit for that. But he couldn't have done it without the input of his brother and without the Paddy Mayne putting those ideas into practice.
We're going to take a short break. We'll be back with you in a moment. Welcome back. I'm joined by Gavin Mortimer, and we're discussing 2 SAS. What I am intrigued by, and I'm not sure if there's a clean-cut answer for this, but I was reading the book, I was trying to put jigsaw pieces together, and I thought, when it comes to special operations, is it down to the units to find jobs to do, or is the planners who sit there thinking, we need this to happen, let's approach them to do it? Or is it just sort of some old boy network chats over gin that thinks, well, we could do this, we could do that, and there's sort of a continual back and forth?
Yeah, good question. David Stirling in 1942, as I said, he wasted the SAS, if you like. He was gallivanting. He was going off on these harebrained operations, which were farcical. And I've interviewed veterans of a long-range desert group who respected Stirling for his courage, but said, frankly, he cut so many corners. He was a logistical shambles. He relied on the long-range desert group for petrol, for navigation, for signals. I think Bill, in a way, suffered from that, because one of the reasons that the SAS expanded into a regiment, that it then allowed GHQ to bring him under control more. When he went off to Tunisia and got caught, he shouldn't have done it. And he really went off and without the permission of GHQ. And Sean Hackett, who was in command of raiding forces at the time, was signal saying, "What the hell are you doing? Where are you going?" And Stirling would, when he wanted to avoid something, he just wouldn't reply. So I think they were more determined with Bill to keep the SAS under control. But that wasn't really Bill's modus operandi anyway. But then, of course, your question leads nicely on to what happened in 1944 when 2 SAS returned to Europe, and their operations for D-Day on the 4th of April. The SAS were issued with an operational order by 21 Army Group responsible for planning the invasion of France, and it stated that the primary task of the SAS would be, quotes, attacks on suitable types of objectives in the concentration areas of hostile, mobile, strategic reserves behind the length of the French Channel coast. So in effect, the SAS would parachute into an area inland from the coast to a depth of 40 miles, as and when German panzer reserves were observed moving towards a beachhead. As Mike Sadler, who's still alive, told me, he described he was an intelligence officer. He in-road heroes and then became, as he just said to me, that was suicide. We were lightly armed, really a rapid reaction force. What were we supposed to do against German panzer divisions moving up? We'd have just been annihilated. And Bill Stirling was so infuriated that he really sacrificed his career to get that order cancelled. And I describe in the book that the denouement was this meeting with Boyd Browning at the end of May 1944. What Bill said was, no, listen, it's madness, and it's not what we're trained for. We are trained, as we showed you in Italy, to be dropped deep behind enemy lines to disrupt their lines of communication. This is what we're made for in France. So drop us into central France, into Brittany, and we will delay the German reinforcements and supplies reaching Normandy. Bill wasn't the most discreet man, and I think he was justifiably incandescent, and he was sacked. But the operational order was scrubbed, and indeed the SAS brigade, so by now you had 1 and 2 SAS, the British, you had 3 and 4, which are French, and you had a company of Belgian. So about 2,500 in total. And they were dropped really in an area the French were dropped in Brittany and did a superb job in more or less cutting Brittany off from the rest of France. Suffered heavy casualties, but so did the Germans. And the other task that they did was the SS was to work with the Maquis. The Maquis by now had the arms, the explosives, but they had little organisation. So working with the SAS, they were very effective, and jeeps were dropped in, as Bill had suggested, first actually by parachute, and then they came in by aircraft, and brilliant in allowing the SAS to move very quickly through these. I'm talking to you about 50 miles from the Morvan, which was one of the big SAS operations, and I go there quite a lot. It's sort of like Brothers Grimm forests, these deep forests, perfect for guerrilla warfare. And you can still see where the SAS camps, and where the Maquis camps, where they carried out these ambushes. So that was brilliant. But to get it through the thick skulls of 21 Army Group, Bill had to sacrifice himself. And that, I think, is also a factor in why he would have been pretty bitter, I think, at the way he was cast aside. So he went back to Cairo, left the military, and that was it. After the war, he carried on. He had so many business interests. He was someone, the family tell me, who compartmentalized his life. So the war was over. That was in the past. So I've never found any trace of a written record or any interview with Bill talking about the war. And as I said, even the SAS War Diary describes him as the man from the shadows. But don't forget, David Stirling, for the first 10 years after the war, as he himself said, I had nothing to do with the SAS. He went off to Southern Africa. What happened in 1955? Paddy Mayne was killed in a car crash. And David, who by this stage was a bit of a lost soul, saw the opportunity to rewrite SAS history. And the result of that was the publication in 1958 of The Phantom Major, an entertaining book, but in terms of authenticity, accuracy, I would say probably 6 out of 10.
You do wonder what the relationship was between the two brothers, or did Bill just not worry too much about his reputation when it came to the SAS? I mean, I'm not even sure how well known were the SAS at the time, if you know what I mean. It's something that's come into being, and certainly from the Iranian embassy siege, it sort of exploded onto the world. I remember watching that live as a kid and just being kind of agog. But, I wonder if he reflected upon it in his lifetime to his brother. I guess if you've never written anything, we'll never know.
That's it. It's very strange. And it's interesting. I mean, I believe there is a letter that from Bill to David, because David started the Capricorn Society, which was a sort of a civil liberties group in southern Africa. Again, David wasn't very good with finances, and Bill was a very generous man and helped out his siblings, and he pumped a lot of money into the Capricorn Society. And there's a letter from him in about 1954 saying to David, "You've got to get your financial house in order because I'm not a bottomless pit." So now, whether that was a source of resentment that festered on David's part, I couldn't say. It's certainly strange that in 1984, when David opened the refurbished Stirling's Lines, named after David, not Bill, in Hereford, so the 2 SAS, he said in his speech, there are 5 founders of the SAS. Myself, Paddy Mayne, Jock Lewis, Georges Berger, who was a Frenchman, and John Woodhouse. John Woodhouse was an important figure post-war, but not in the SAS during the war. He didn't mention his own brother. Now, as I said, no, the quip was SAS, Stirling and Stirling. Extraordinary that he didn't mention his own brother, who by this time was dead. But you make a really important point, Angus, that for the first 25 years after the war, it was the LRDG who were the glamour boys. And they were really well known. There was a famous, was it Sea of Sand in 1959 with Dickie Attenborough, which was a big box office hit. There was a Hollywood series, Rat Patrol, I think, in the 60s. So it was very much the LRDG who sort of embodied the rather World War II Lawrence of Arabia, if you like. And the SAS, of course, too. The Long Range Desert Group were disbanded. Just quick sort of reprise of what happened immediately after the war. LRDG, SAS, SBS disbanded by the Labour government, October 45. Lovely new dawn of peace, no more war, etc., etc. Soon now, as the British Empire began to disintegrate very rapidly, suddenly realised, so from the Malayan emergency, so 2 SAS were raised out of the sort of a territorial SAS, which were first reformed in 47. Two SAS, as we know the SAS today, 1952. They wanted to fly below the radar, and that's how it was. They were fighting a lot of wars in Borneo, in Aden, in Malaya, and men in Northern Ireland. Changed, as you say, literally overnight. And like yourself, I'm just old enough to remember May 1980 and the embassy siege. And really, it was the first reality TV. Watching it live, and it was just a visual delight, because you had these very elegant whitewashed building, and then these black figures abseiling down it, and how glamorous. And researching the biography of David Stirling, reading the newspapers of the time, and don't forget, it was at a time when Britain was, it was just the 1970s had been a brutal decade for Britain. Economically, the sick man of Europe, and suddenly we had something to be proud about. And David Stirling capitalised on that. And by now, as I said, Paddy Mayne was dead. Bill Stirling died in 1983, but didn't have anything to do with the SS. Jock Lewis, the other influential founder, had been killed in the war. So there was only really David left. And boy, did he exploit the newfound fame. Everyone wanted to know about the SAS. And that, of course, continued with the Falklands War and Pebble Island, etc. And so a spate of books came out. David wrote the foreword to a lot of them. His own authorised biography was published just around the time of his death in 1990, and that consolidated the legend of David Stirling. Now, I've been criticised in some quarters because I reassessed David Stirling. David Stirling rewrote the SAS history and the Phantom Major. In my book, The Phony Major, I rewrote Phantom Major, if you like. So, I was quite parts brutal with David Stirling, but I think he deserved to be, not because of what he did in the war. Really brave man, and he was very important it was a joint effort with Bill Stirling, but it's what he did after the war, the way he quite purposely not only diminished the role of his own brother, but also Paddy Mayne. And it was David Stirling who began this transformation of Paddy Mayne into this dark, sinister, brooding, wild, undisciplined Irishman. I mean, for goodness sake, he studied law at Queen's, Belfast. He then joined in 1939 one of the top firm of solicitors in Belfast. He played rugby for Ireland and the British Lions. I mean, he was an extraordinarily talented and intelligent man. But it was David Stirling who was jealous of Paddy Mayne throughout his life. As I said, David, in a way, deserves more respect for his physical courage than Paddy Mayne, because for Paddy Mayne, it came naturally. For David, he wasn't a guerrilla fighter, but he forced himself by extraordinary show of courage going on these missions. But he didn't have much success. It was Paddy Mayne and Bill Fraser who had the success. The other people who David diminished were the Long Range Desert Group, particularly Guy Prendergast, who was the CO from 1941 until for the last 2 years of the Desert War, who didn't like David Stirling, or didn't have any respect for him. Compared some of his antics to a Gilbert and Sullivan comic opera, and just time and again, had to dig David Stirling out of a logistical hole. And so Stirling spent a lot of his time post-war reducing the effect and calling them a taxi service, and they were far more than that.
Well, you've got to wonder as well, David Stirling was only there for a certain piece of the SAS history during the war. There is a lot of SAS history that's nothing to do with him, and you do wonder how he might reflect upon that, because it's not about him. If you're slightly narcissistic and try to rewrite things, you concentrate on this period that you're involved with.
Exactly. exactly. Yeah, and there's a very interesting. I quote these signals in my biography of David Stirling. When Stirling was released from Colditz in April 1945, SAS now were in Germany, a bloody business. Really, the carrying out reconnaissance for the armour, pushing east into Germany, and a lot of Hitler Youth and the werewolves, etc. Anyway, on I think it was about 21st of April, Stirling sends a message back in the UK in great heart. Can't wait to come out and join you. And Brian Franks, who knew Stirling socially, replies immediately, "Oh, wonderful news! Looking forward to having you out here and resuming command." And then Paddy Mayne replies about 12 hours later, "Glad to hear you're free. Have a long leave and take the long rest that you deserve." In other words, stay away from the SAS, because he knew what Stirling was really like, and I think that's it is a point worth making, Angus, that in a way David Stirling being captured was a blessing in disguise, because it allowed Paddy Mayne and Bill Stirling and also George Jellicoe, who took command of SBS and worked with 2SAS a lot in 1943, to really take control of the SAS. And that's right, as you said, it really began. That's when in 1943 it began to evolve and develop, and it became so much more than this private army going off in these really inconsequential raids that often ended in fiasco in the desert, into becoming something, spearhead of the Sicily invasion, and then playing a crucial role in the invasion of France in 1944.
So when David Stirling is doing these small pinprick raids, do they get any press coverage? Could he at least point to the press to say, "Oh, look, I've been lauded," and so the press could say, "Oh, we've got a winner in the desert," when we're looking for victories and we're looking for good news? Was it covered in the press, or are these small armies, private armies, not getting much recognition? It's not something I'm really aware of ever popping up.
The Phantom Major, according to David Stirling, that was what Rommel came up with that nickname. Rommel thought that the SAS were part of the LRDG. He knew about the LRDG. Ralph Bagnold and Prendergast, you never heard any LRDG officer publicly give their name, or they revealed very little. In September 1942, from Australia to America to Britain, the Phantom Major was splashed across the newspapers, and it talked of David Stirling. Who came up with the name the Phantom Major? Randolph Churchill. And Randolph Churchill, and I spoke to several SAS veterans who were in the SAS at the time of Randolph Churchill's SAS career began in about late April 42 and ended about 3 weeks later. And most of that time he spent it getting very drunk. Now, again, you see, this shows Stirling's strengths, that he saw that getting Randolph Churchill in the SAS would be a great way of having the ear of Winston Churchill and getting some publicity. He went on one raid, Randolph Churchill, to Benghazi with Stirling and Fitzroy MacLean, and it was a shambles. And that's when the LRGD said it was like some comic opera. But Churchill came to Cairo in August 1942, when the war in the desert. So this was the hinge of fate, when Montgomery was appointed. So he reshuffled, and Auchinleck was fired, and Montgomery. And it was when the desert war was at its low point. He briefly met Stirling. It wasn't, as Stirling would have us believe afterwards, 2 long dinners. I mean, this was a crucial part of the war. But as a favour to Randolph, he met Stirling and a few other officers. A month later, this Phantom Major appeared, and that was a propaganda exercise into giving the British public a hero at a time when we needed a hero. 1942, the war was not going well. The first scoop of a Phantom Major was in the Evening Standard. Who worked for the Evening Standard? Randolph Churchill. And so he got all the information from David Stirling. Right, it's a great propaganda piece. It's hilarious to read. He's a 6'5", a champion boxer, champion horse rider, and he goes out on his own and destroys 50 aircraft. And that's where the legend began of a Phantom Major. And that's what the name of the book in 1958. But it was very much an example of the way Stirling was a great self-publicist. And that's the key. And that's why he became synonymous with the SAS and not his brother. And interestingly, in 1950, he tried to get a history of a wartime SAS published, a collaboration with various others, one of whom was Paddy Mayne. The book never came to fruition. Why not? Well, I suspect that Paddy Mayne didn't want to have anything to do with it and said no. But once Paddy Mayne was killed in the car crash, the way was open for David Stirling, not only to publish a book, but twist it, recasting himself as this great devil-may-care, brilliant buccaneering special forces legend. He was a brave man. He was an ideas man. But without Bill Stirling and without Paddy Mayne, David Stirling would not have been able to do what he did.
Well, good stuff. Thank you, Gavin. Loyal listener, if you want to read about the exploits of 2SAS and Bill Stirling, the book to pick up is 2SAS, Bill Stirling and the Forgotten Special Forces Unit of World War II. I will put a link in the show notes. Don't forget, if you are not already a patron of the podcast, you can sign up at patreon.com/WW2podcast. I do try to make available extras for patrons of the show, and I am about to ask Gavin about SAS Action Man. That might make more sense to listeners in the UK than other parts of the world. So if you want to help me find the time to put the show together, and if you do enjoy the show every couple of weeks, why not go to patreon.com/WW2podcast and become a patron of the show. Now, I should have a third episode of the podcast this month. Next time out, we should be discussing the role of hospital trains during the war. So until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town and blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.